I don't personally know anyone who could say they're doing really great this January. For so many of us, the Omicron wave has been really hard and it's been very isolating. I know that this moment looks different for everyone. Some of us are with the same people all the time or the same one person. Some of us are alone much of the time. Some of us are just out there in the mix with all the people in the world because of our job or because it's just too unbearably soul crushing to isolate for this long. A couple of weeks ago, our family found ourselves all quarantined together, as so many of us have been lately, after a COVID exposure at my son's preschool. And not only were we all stuck together at home, but preschool was closed for the next 10 days. By this point in the pandemic, this is familiar terrain, figuring out how to do family life and stay on top of work somehow with two kids in the mix, one of whom is a 4-year-old who's constantly needing to move his body and is always searching for a playmate or something to destroy if no playmates present themselves. And we're doing all the things that we've learned to do by now, trying to fold in self care to help us feel more alive and feel less stuck, constantly letting go of our expectations and surrendering to what is, which I'll admit I'm often doing with no small amount of self pity. A super helpful tool for helping me feel unstuck has been music. And I use dance music to make boring domestic tasks feel more bearable, like getting the dishes done after dinner when the sun has already been down for a while and everybody's feeling kind of drowsy and done with the day. And so during this particular most recent quarantine time, I put my phone nice and close to the sink so I could really hear those tunes while I was doing dishes. And oh no, some water splashed into the USB port, that spot where you plug in your phone to charge it, which led to not being able to charge my phone, which led to it dying. And then I was still in jail. I mean, pardon me, I was in quarantine with my children in my home, but without access to my phone, without access to those group text threads and phone calls and other social apps that have been lifelines for me for the past 2 years. Mm. Extra isolated, extra disconnected. Just yuck. Feeling disconnected, lonely, feeling isolated, invisible. These are really painful human experiences. They're hard on our bodies, on our psyches, and on our souls. We are beings who evolved as deeply relational creatures. And so feeling connected for us is really about survival. Feeling seen and known, that sense of belonging and connection, these are fundamental needs for human beings. And in their absence, we really suffer. When we feel lonely and disconnected, the pain that we experience, it's not just emotional. It turns out that those feelings of social disconnection, they actually light up the same neural pathways as physical pain. When we feel socially isolated, excluded, or invisible, it hurts. Loneliness hurts. What do you think of when you think of loneliness? Is there like a picture of loneliness in your mind? A story that you carry about what loneliness is and what fixes it? Personally, the first thing that pops into my mind is a person who's actually all alone in a space. In my head, for whatever reason, it's someone sitting alone at a kitchen table, gazing out the window. And the unexamined story I have about that person is that they're lonely due to the absence of other people in the space. So I'm basically conflating solitude and loneliness. And if you were to ask me if those were the same things, I would definitely tell you no. And I might prattle on about the spiritual benefits of solitude. But deep down in my subconscious, pre thinking self, I still get these things confused. Solitude, of course, can be not only just fine, it can be hugely rejuvenating, healing, generative. even essential to find our balance in life. There's nothing necessarily lonely about being alone because loneliness isn't about being alone. Loneliness is about an experience of disconnection, unwanted disconnection. And often loneliness feels especially lonely in the presence of other people. Feeling lonely at a party, in a workplace, feeling lonely in our family, in our friendships, lonely in a partnership, a marriage, feeling lonely in our pain or in our fear. We experience spiritual loneliness when we can't seem to get access to that sense of oneness with everything, or we can't feel God's presence in a time of struggle, or walk through the woods feels empty instead of connecting. Loneliness is an experience of disconnection, and it's a part of the human experience. And today we're going to reflect on some spiritual tools for navigating these experiences of loneliness in our relationship. But before we go there, I just want to take a moment here to really consciously note that there are some relationships that feel bad to us because they're actively doing us harm. And there are some toxic relationships that simply cannot be repaired or redeemed. And abuse in relationships is never to be tolerated. And if you're experiencing abuse or if you want to talk to someone, we're going to put a link in the chat to Crossroads Safe House, which provides support locally here in Northern Colorado around domestic violence and interpersonal abuse. And it's just a hard thing to talk about loneliness, even when we're talking about the healthiest of relationships, because there's stigma around it. We feel like there's something wrong with us. It's hard on our self image, our sense of self worth to admit that we feel lonely. But it's essential to talk about it because when we don't name it, we can go to dangerous places when our loneliness goes unchecked. Social neuroscientist John Cacioppo reminds us that as a social species, our brains have evolved to react to the experience of being pushed out to the margins socially, the experience of feeling like an outsider by going to a place of self preservation. Our body interprets feeling left out, feeling disconnected as a threat, to the point that even when we really want connection deep down, our brain can keep trying to suppress our impulse towards connection by pushing us towards self protection and putting up armor. And then we find ourselves isolating, afraid to reach out or show vulnerability. We end up feeling even more alone and more defensive, and sometimes choosing things to help us numb our feelings instead of feeling them and moving through them. And sometimes this isolating, self-preserving mode, it further calcifies these stories that we're holding, stories about who we are, stories about who someone else is, stories that keep us stuck and lonely, and they keep our compassion at bay, and they keep possibility away. All right, I'm going to pivot here to a story about a time when I saw some possibilities and made some assumptions. One summer, we learned that a neighbor down the street had a kid who was exactly my daughter's age. We had connected with them a few times. They seemed really nice, and we were excited to know them more and hopefully to make friends. That's kind of a vulnerable place, right? That feeling of liking someone else and wanting them to like you so you can become friends. So we invited them over for popsicles one afternoon after school got out. And when that afternoon rolled around, our neighbor, she texted me to say they were running a few minutes late. And I texted back, no problem. And I shared our street number again. And there was no response. Okay, that's cool. My daughter asked to wait outside for our visitors. I said yes. She's out there for about 30 minutes. I think she made a handmade sign to welcome them to our house. No one shows up. I decide that maybe the mom has some challenges with time management, but that's fine. I do too sometimes. So I text her to check in, assure her that it's fine, that they're late, we have no plans. No response. I text back and ask what kind of popsicles they like. Nothing. So my daughter asks if she can bike down to their house. So she does. And she comes back with an observation that was pulling out of the driveway and it seemed like no one was home. She's really deflated. And so an hour later, this is like an hour after the beginning, I text again asking if she wants to reschedule. I totally understand. I also call her and leave her a voicemail. My daughter is crying because she's so disappointed. She'd been waiting all week to discover this new friend on the street. And at this point, I'm really tempted to blame this other person for my child's pain because who is this late without saying anything? And just as I've completely given up, about 2 hours after we originally agreed to meet up, I hear a bing on my phone. It's a text and it's from the mom. And the text reads, "Sorry it didn't work out today. Maybe we could try another time." What? Sorry it didn't work out today? I've been hounding you with prompts to come over that you seem to have totally ignored. And now my little girl is beside herself with disappointment, and you are sorry that it didn't work out. So I'm actively willing myself not to draw conclusions with so little information. There's a total dearth of information here. But my brain is also just spinning off in its own direction. And I find myself thinking, I wonder if she's been drinking. Is this family in crisis? And despite my better judgment, I let my mind weave a story of total chaos at their house and how probably in the future, in all these years that we're going to share a block together, their house won't be a safe place for my kids to go and play, and it'll be awkward. And I'll probably end up being the safe house for her children. And I know that I don't actually know these people, but my brain is just spinning these wild stories. And I get a call then later in the evening, and it's from the neighbor mom. And it turns out that I am not the only person with whom she has been having weird text exchanges. And it is because she just got a new phone. I guess there's a phone theme here this morning. But most of her incoming texts and phone calls were still routing to her old phone, which she'd packed up in a box to send back to the manufacturer. And she discovered all of my attempts at communication later that day when she went to check her old phone, along with lots of other messages from other people whom she had experienced as mysteriously silent all week. And it turns out she'd wondered why I hadn't responded to her. She was really confused. Apparently, she'd sent messages to me that I never got. Anyway, mystery solved. We make inferences all the time about other people based on the information we have. We can't help it. It's what we're built to do. And it turns out that while we're really good at creating stories and judgments about other people, we are not very good at creating accurate stories and judgments about other people. And even with those people who are closest to us. Behavioral scientist Nick Epley has been researching the ways that we guess what's going on in someone else's mind. He and his colleagues, they conducted this study with couples who had been together for an average of 10 years. So they probably know each other pretty well, right? And in the study, they asked one partner to predict how the other partner would respond to some simple questions. Questions like, I would rather spend a quiet evening at home rather than going out to a party. Or, our family is too heavily in debt. And the partner asking the question, they estimated ahead of time that they would do great. They would really accurately guess what the other person would think about that question. And it turns out that they only guessed what was going on in the other person's mind accurately 25% of the time. That's not very good. We have huge confidence in our ability to infer what someone close to us thinks and feels. But this is often not the case. It turns out that mind reading is not really our thing. And to make things even harder, we don't even think to ask things of our closest people in the kind of the kind of direct and simple questions that we might ask of a stranger. We stop being curious and we just keep feeding these old stories. And this can leave us feeling really lonely and stuck in our relationships. We're creatures of narrative. I'm going to take a drink of water here. Stories help anchor us, they help us make meaning. Stories help us understand who we are and help us understand the world around us. And we cannot do life without stories. We don't have a soul without stories. Um, okay, I just said that. I don't know if don't quote me on that one. And our brains can't help but to create stories. But sometimes when we are feeling lonely, disconnected, frustrated, or sad in our relationships, we have to let go of the stories that we're holding in order to make space in our hearts, to make space in our hearts for possibility, space for tenderness, space for connection, space for a new way. Buddhist nun Pema Chodron calls this practice dropping the storyline. I wonder what storylines you might be holding these days. Maybe it's a story about why a friend is reaching out with less frequency or seems distracted or prickly. Maybe it's a story about why our partner always wants to unwind by themselves in the evening. Or on the other hand, why our partner is always stuck to us like glue. Maybe it's a story about why the teenager in our life looks at us with irritation and contempt sometimes, or why our boss seems so difficult and unreasonable lately. What might we discover if we dared to let go of the stories we're holding in our relationships? I don't mean denying what we're feeling, but I mean let experimenting with letting go of the stories we've created around it, especially our story about what's going on in someone else's mind and heart. We can still tune into our feelings, feel them and honor them, and experience the messiness and difficulty of a situation. But we stop short of letting our feelings harden and grasping onto assumptions or labels or stories that come whizzing into our brain and that send us into that defensive, self protective place. Even when the thing we most deeply want is actually connection. Instead of following a tempting storyline at hand, we could get curious about another person's world, curious about what needs they're trying to meet, remembering that our vulnerability and pain connects us with the shared tenderness among all human beings, a tenderness we share even with those people who are hard for us. They have tender hearts too. I have to admit, this is pretty easy to talk about, but it can be really, really hard to practice in the moment. Even in those petty little moments, diving into those practice storylines, it's so tempting. So, I also want to offer a tool, a very practical tool that I have found very helpful personally in getting myself to a place where I can even consider stopping and dropping the storyline. It's a practice that Resma Menakem describes in My Grandmother's Hands called stop, drop, and roll. Maybe that sounds familiar to you. Stop, drop, and roll. It's very helpful for settling yourself when you are emotionally on fire. When you might do or say something you might regret later, or when a situation is escalating. So, we're going to walk through it together here. And just if an invitation here, if you want to experiment with this right now, you could bring to mind a storyline about a storyline that you're holding in this particular moment, a storyline in a relationship in your life, and try this on. So, first is stop. Stop whatever you're saying, stop whatever you're thinking or doing. Just let go of the storyline and don't go any further down the same emotional and mental path. Just stop. And then drop back. Pay attention to what you're feeling in your body. Drop into what is going on around you. Drop into where the situation seems headed and how you're helping to push it in that direction. And then ask yourself, is this where I want this interaction to go? And if not, you can say out loud, let's not go where I think we're headed. Let's figure out something different. So you stop what you're saying, thinking, or doing. You drop into your experience, drop into the present moment of your surroundings. And then finally, just roll with whatever you notice is happening in your body, but without fighting, fleeing, or freezing. Just keep breathing through it. Don't try to control it or run from it or squelch it or tear it to pieces. And you might find that you weep or laugh or shudder or moan or you want to hug yourself. And if so, just roll with it. Just let go and do it. And with some luck, you might just find yourself in a more settled place than where you started, a place of softness and receptivity, a place where you can offer yourself some compassion and curiosity, and maybe even offer the other person some compassion and some curiosity, and consider the next move in the dance of relationship. In these times that feel like they might just crush us with disconnection and uncertainty, where even in the company of others, loneliness can encroach and weigh us down, the hard place doesn't have to be the end of the story. Let us remember that we were each made for love and relationship. We were each made for connection. It's in our DNA and it's inscribed on our souls. And every day is an opportunity to stop, drop, and roll, and then just let go of our tired storylines so that we might generate more love and more connection through tenderness and curiosity. I'm so glad to be together with you in this. May it be so. Amen.